They mounted their swift black horses and spurred them with abandoned savagery down the hillside towards the marsh, their cloaks whipping behind them as the wind caught them, lashing them high into the air. Both rode with set, hard faces, refusing to acknowledge the aching uncertainty which lurked within them. And the horses' hooves had splashed into quaking bogland before they could halt. Cursing, Elric tugged hard on his reins, pulling his horse back onto firm ground. Sha'ria, too, fought her own panicky stallion and guided the beast to the safety of the turf. "Well, how do we cross?" Elric asked her impatiently. "There was a map," Sha'ria began hesitantly. "Well, where is it?" I was lost. I lost it, but I tried hard to memorize it. I think I'll be able to get us safely across." "Well, how did you lose it, and why didn't you tell me of this before?" Elric stormed. "I'm sorry, Elric, but for a whole day, just before I found you in that tavern, my memory was gone. Somehow I lived through a day without knowing it, and when I awoke the map was missing." Elric frowned. "Well, there is some force working against us, I am sure, but what it is I do not know." He raised his voice and said to her, "Well, let's hope that your memory is not too faulty now. These marshes are infamous the world over, but by all accounts only natural hazards wait for us." He grimaced and put his fingers around the hilt of his rune sword. "Best go first, Sha'ria, but stay close. Lead the way." She nodded, dumbly, and turning her horse's head towards the north, galloping along the bank until she came to a place where a great tapering rock loomed. Here a grassy path, 4 feet or so across, led out into a misty marsh. They could only see a little distance ahead because of the clinging mist, but it seemed that the trail remained firm for some way. Sha'ria walked her horse onto the path and jolted forward at a slow trot, Elric following immediately behind her. Through the swirling heavy mist, which shone whitely, the horses moved hesitantly, and their riders had to keep them on short, tight rein. The mist padded the marsh with silence, and the gleaming watery fens around them stank with foul putrescence. No animal scurried, no bird shrieked above them. Everywhere was a haunting, fear-laden silence which made both horses and riders uneasy. With panic in their throats, Elric and Sha'ria rode on, deeper and deeper into the unnatural marshes of the mist, their eyes weary and even their nostrils quivering for scent of danger in the stinking morass. Hours later, when the sun was long past its zenith, Sha'ria's horse reared, screaming and whinnying. She shouted for Elric, her exquisite features twisted in fear as she stared into the mist. He spurred his own bucking horse forwards and joined her. Something moved slowly, menacingly in the clinging whiteness. Elric's right hand whipped over to his left side and grasped the hilt of Stormbringer. The blade shrieked out of its scabbard, a black fire gleaming along its length, and alien power flowing from it into Elric's arm and through his body. A weird, unholy light leapt into Elric's crimson eyes, and his mouth was wrenched into a hideous grin as he forced the frightened horse further into the skulking mist. "Arioch, Lord of the Seven Darks, be with me now!" Elric yelled as he made out the shifting shape ahead of him. It was white like the mist, yet somehow darker. It stretched high above Elric's head. It was nearly 8 feet tall and almost as broad, but it was still only an outline, seeming to have no face or limbs, only movement. Darting, malevolent movement. But Arioch, his patron god, chose not to hear. Elric could feel his horse's great heart beating between his legs as the beast plunged forward under its rider's iron control. Sha'ria was screaming something behind him, but he could not hear the words. Elric hacked at the white shape, but his sword met only mist, and it howled angrily. The fear-crazed horse would go no further, and Elric was forced to dismount. "Keep hold of the steed," he shouted behind him to Sha'ria, and moved on to light feet towards the darting shape which hovered ahead of him, blocking his path. Now he could make out some of its saliencies. 2 eyes, the colour of thin yellow wine, were set high in the thing's body, though it had no separate head. A mouthing, obscene slit filled with fangs lay just beneath the eyes. It had no nose or ears that Elric could see. 4 appendages sprang from its upper parts, and its lower body slithered along the ground, unsupported by any limbs. Elric's eyes ached as he looked at it. It was incredibly disgusting to behold, and its amorphous body gave off a stench of death and decay. Fighting down his fear, the albino inched forward warily, his sword held high to parry any thrust the thing might make with its arms. Elric recognized it from a description in one of his grimoires. It was a mist giant, possibly the only mist giant, Belbane. Even the wisest wizards were uncertain how many existed, one or many. It was a ghoul of the swamplands, which fed off the souls and the blood of men and beasts, but the marshes of this mist were far to the east of Belbane's reputed haunts. Elric ceased to wonder why so few animals inhabited the stretch of the swamp, and overhead the sky was beginning to darken. Stormbringer throbbed in Elric's grasp as he called the names of the ancient demon gods of his people. The nauseous ghoul obviously recognized the names. For an instant it wavered backwards. Elric made his legs move towards the thing. Now he saw that the ghoul was not white at all, but it had no colour to it that Elric could recognise. There was a suggestion of orangeness, dashed with sickening greenish yellow. But he did not see the colours with his eyes. He only sensed the alien, unholy tinctures. Then Elric rushed towards the thing, shouting the names which now had no meaning to his surface consciousness. Balan, Martham, Aesmar, Alastor, Cybos, Verdelet, Nitsilfkim, Haborum of the fires which destroy. His whole mind was torn in two. Part of him wanted to run, to hide, but he had no control over the power which now gripped him and pushed him to meet the horror. His sword blade hacked and slashed at the shape. It was like trying to cut through water, sentient, pulsating water. But Stormbringer had effect. The whole shape of the ghoul quivered as if in dreadful pain. Elric felt himself plucked into the air, and his vision went. He could see nothing, do nothing but hack and cut at the thing which now held him. Sweat poured from him as blindly he fought on. Pain which was hardly physical, a deeper, horrifying pain, filled his being as he howled now in agony and struck continually at the yielding bulk which embraced him and was pulling him slowly towards its gaping maw. He struggled and writhed in the obscene grasp of the thing. With powerful arms it was holding him, almost lasciviously, drawing him closer as a rough lover would draw a girl. Even the mighty power intrinsic in the rune sword did not seem enough to kill the monster. Though its efforts were somewhat weaker than earlier, it still drew Elric nearer to the gnashing, slavering mouth slit. Elric cried the names again, while Stormbringer danced and sang an evil song in his right hand. In agony Elric writhed, praying, begging, promising, but still he was drawn inch by inch towards the grinning maw. Savagely, grimly he fought, and again he screamed for Arioch. A mind touched his, sardonic, powerful, evil, and he knew Arioch responded at last. Almost imperceptibly the mist giant weakened. Elric pressed his advantage, and the knowledge that the ghoul was losing its strength gave him more power. Blindly, agony piercing every nerve of his body, he struck and struck. Then, quite suddenly, he was falling. He seemed to fall for hours, slowly, weightlessly, until he landed upon a surface which yielded beneath him. He began to sink. Far off, beyond time and space, he heard a distant voice calling to him. He did not want to hear it. He was content to lie where he was as the cold, comforting stuff in which he lay dragged him slowly into itself. Then some sixth sense made him realize that it was Sharilla's voice calling him, and he forced himself to make sense out of the words. Elric, the marsh. You're in the marsh. Don't move. He smiled to himself. Why should he move? Down he was sinking, slowly, calmly, down into the welcoming marsh. Had there been another time like this? Another marsh? And with a mental jolt, full awareness of the situation came back to him and he jerked his eyes open. Above him was mist. To one side a pool of unnameable colouring was slowly evaporating, giving off a foul odour. On the other side he could just make out a human form gesticulating wildly. Beyond the human form were the barely discernible shapes of two horses. Sharilla was there. Beneath him was the marsh. Thick, stinking slime was sucking him downwards as he lay spread-eagled upon it, half submerged already. Stormbringer was still in his right hand. He could just see it if he turned his head. Carefully he tried to lift the top half of his body from the sucking morass. He succeeded, only to feel his legs sink deeper. Sitting upright, he shouted to the girl, "Sharia, quickly, a rope." "There is no rope, Elric." She was ripping off her top garment, frantically tearing it into strips. Still Elric sank, his feet finding no purchase beneath them. Sharia hastily knotted the strips of cloth. She flung the makeshift rope inexpertly towards the sinking albino. It fell short. Fumbling in her haste, she threw it again. This time his groping left hand found it. The girl began to haul on the fabric. Elric felt himself rise a little and then stop. "It's no good, Elric, I haven't the strength." Cursing her, Elric shouted, "The horse! Tie it to the horse!" She ran towards one of the horses and looped the cloth round the pommel of the saddle. Then she tugged at the beast's reins and began to walk it away. Swiftly Elric was dragged from the sucking bog, and still gripping Stormbringer was pulled to the inadequate safety of the strip of turf. Gasping, he tried to stand, but found his legs incredibly weak beneath him. He rose, staggered and fell. Sharilla knelt down beside him. "Are you hurt?" Elric smiled in spite of his weakness. "I don't think so." "It was dreadful. I couldn't see properly what was happening. You seemed to disappear, and then you screamed that name." She was trembling, her face pale and taut. "What name?" Elric was genuinely puzzled. "What name did I scream?" She shook her head. "It doesn't matter, but whatever it was that saved you. You reappeared soon afterwards and fell into the marsh." Stormbringer's power was still flowing into the albino. He already felt stronger. With an effort he got up and stumbled unsteadily towards his horse. "And I'm sure that the mist giant does not usually haunt this marsh. It was sent here. By what or whom, I don't know. But we must get to firmer ground while we can," Sharilla said. "Which way, back or forward?" Elric frowned. "Well, forward, of course. Why do you ask?" She swallowed and shook her head. "Well, let's hurry then," she said. They mounted their horses and rode with little caution until the marsh and its cloak of mist was behind them. Now the journey took on a new urgency as Elric realized that some force was attempting to put obstacles in their way. They rested little and savagely rode their powerful horses to a virtual standstill. On the 5th day they were riding through barren, rocky country and a light rain was falling. The hard ground was slippery, so that they were forced to ride more slowly, huddled over the sodden necks of their horses, muffled in cloaks which only inadequately kept out the drizzling rain. They had ridden in silence for some time before they heard a ghastly, cackling baying ahead of them and the rattle of hooves. Elric motioned towards a large rock looming to their right. "Shelter here," he said. "Something comes towards us, possibly more enemies. With luck they'll pass us." Sharilla mutely obeyed him, and together they waited as the hideous baying grew nearer. "One rider, several other beasts," Elric said, listening intently. "The beasts either follow or pursue the rider." Then they were in sight, racing through the rain, a man frantically spurring an equally frightened horse, and behind him, the distance decreasing, a pack of what at first appeared to be dogs. These were no dogs. They were half dog and half bird, with the lean, shaggy body and legs of dogs, but possessing bird-like talons in place of paws and savagely curved beaks which snapped where muzzles should have been. "The hunting dogs of Darji," gasped Sharia. I thought that they, like their masters, were long extinct. Why, I also, Elric said. What are they doing in these parts? There was never contact between the Darji and the dwellers of this land. Brought here by something, Sharola whispered. Those devil dogs will scent us, to be sure. Elric reached for his rune sword. Well, then we can lose nothing by aiding their quarry, he said, urging his mount forward. Wait here, Sharola. By this time the devil pack and the men they pursued were rushing past the sheltered rock, speeding down a narrow defile. Elric spurred his horse down the slope. "Ho there," he shouted to the frantic rider. "Turn and stand, my friend, I'm here to aid you." The moaning rune sword lifted high, Elric thundered towards the snapping, howling devil dogs, and his horse's hooves struck one with an impact which broke the unnatural beast's spine. There were some 5 or 6 of the weird dogs left. The rider turned his horse and drew a long sabre from a scabbard at his waist. He was a small man, with a broad, ugly mouth. He grinned in relief. "A lucky chance, this meeting, good master." This was all the time that he had to remark before 2 of the dogs were leaping at him, and he was forced to give his whole attention to defending himself from their slashing talons and snapping beaks. The other 3 dogs concentrated their vicious attacks upon Elric. One leapt high, its beak aimed at Elric's throat. He felt foul breath on his face, and hastily brought Stormbringer around in an arc which chopped the dog in 2. Filthy blood spattered Elric and his horse, and the scent of it seemed to increase the fury of the other dog's attack. But the blood made the dancing black rune sword sing an almost ecstatic tune, and Elric felt it writhe in his grasp and stab at another of the hideous dogs. The point caught the beast just below its breastbone as it reared up at the albino. It screamed in terrible agony and turned its beak to seize the blade, and as the beak connected with the lambent black metal of the sword, a foul stench, akin to the smell of burning, struck Elric's nostrils, and the beast's scream broke off sharply. Engaged with the remaining devil dog, Elric caught a fleeting glimpse of the charred corpse. His horse was rearing high, lashing at the last alien animal with flailing hooves. The dog avoided the horse's attack and came at Elric's unguarded left side. The albino swung in the saddle and brought his sword hurtling down to slice into the dog's skull and spill brains and blood on the wetly gleaming ground. Still somehow alive, the dog snapped feebly at Elric, but the Melnibonéan ignored its futile attack and turned his attention to the little man who had dispensed with one of his adversaries but was having difficulty with the second. The dog had grasped the sabre with its beak, gripping the sword near the hilt. Talons raked across the little man's throat as he strove to shake the dog's grip. Elric charged forward, his rune sword aimed like a lance to where the devil dog dangled in mid-air, its talons slashing, trying to reach the flesh of its former quarry. Stormbringer caught the beast in its lower abdomen and ripped upwards, slitting the thing's underparts from crutch to throat. It released its hold on the small man's sabre and fell writhing to the ground. Elric's horse trampled it into the rocky ground. Breathing heavily, the albino sheathed Stormbringer and warily regarded the man he had saved. He disliked unnecessary contact with anyone, and did not wish to be embarrassed by a display of emotion on the little man's part. He was not disappointed, for the wide, ugly mouth split into a cheerful grin, and the man bowed in the saddle as he returned his own curved blade to its scabbard. "Thanks, good sir," he said lightly. "Without your help the battle might have lasted longer. You deprived me of good sport, but you meant well. Moonglum is my name." "Elric of Melniboné, reported the albino, but saw no reaction on the little man's face. This was strange, for the name of Elric was now infamous throughout most of the world. The story of his treachery and the slaying of his cousin Cymoril had been told and elaborated upon in taverns throughout the young kingdoms. Much as he hated it, he was used to receiving some indication of recognition from those he met. His albinoism was enough to mark him. Intrigued by Moonglum's ignorance and feeling strangely drawn towards the cocky little rider, Elric studied him in an effort to discover from what land he came. Moonglum wore no armour, and his clothes were of faded blue material, travel-stained and worn. A stout leather belt carried the sabre, a dirk, and a woolen purse. Upon his feet Moonglum wore ankle-length boots of cracked leather. His horse furniture was much used, but of obviously good quality. The man himself, seated high in the saddle, was barely more than 5 feet tall, with legs too long in proportion to the rest of his slight body. His nose was short and up-tilted beneath grey-green eyes, large and innocent seeming. A mop of vivid red hair fell over his forehead and down his neck, unrestrained. He sat his horse comfortably, still grinning, but looking now behind Elric to where Sharilla rode to join them. Moonglum bowed elaborately as the girl pulled her horse to a halt. Elric said coldly, "The Lady Sharilla, Master Moonglum of Elfware," Moonglum supplied. "The mercantile capital of the East, finest city in the world." Elric recognized the name. "So you are from Elfware, Master Moonglum. I've heard of the place. A new city, is it not? Some few centuries old. You have ridden far?" "Well, indeed I have, sir. Without knowledge of the language used in these parts, the journey would have been harder, but luckily the slave who inspired me with tales of his homeland taught me the speech thoroughly." "But why do you travel these parts? Have you not heard the legends?" Sharilla spoke incredulously. "Were those very legends what brought me hence? And I'd begun to discount them until those unpleasant pups set upon me. For what reason they decided to give chase I do not know, for I gave them no cause to take a dislike to me. This is indeed a barbarous land." Elric was uncomfortable. Light talk of the kind which Moonglum seemed to enjoy was contrary to his own brooding nature, but in spite of this he found that he was liking the man more and more. It was Moonglum who suggested that they travel together for a while. Sharilla objected, giving Elric a warning glance, but he ignored it. "Very well then, friend Moonglum. Since 3 are stronger than 2, we'd appreciate your company. We ride towards the mountains." Elric himself was feeling in a more cheerful mood. "And what do you seek there?" Moonglum inquired. "A secret," Elric said, and his new-found companion was discreet enough to drop the question.